Hello and welcome to another GiantSlayer TFT Top 5 Countdown video. Today our analysts will be listing the top 5 compositions for patch 11.6. Overall, we're seeing a diverse meta spread across multiple champions, traits, and playstyles. Flexible play is still being rewarded the most, especially for players adept at running Slayer or Mage. With that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we get back to the video, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our top 5, we have Dragonsoul coming in as the number 5 comp. Even though the meta is quite diverse, there's still a large gap between the top 3 compositions and the rest. What that leaves us with is a lot of builds that can easily compete for the 5th spot in the top 5. In fact, we'll be covering the majority of those that didn't make it later on in our honorable mentions. With that said, what gives Dragonsoul the advantage in the meta to earn a spot in the top 5? The main reason is that Dragonsoul boards are in a flexible position to lean either towards Slayers or Mages. Those two traits are dominating the meta, so being able to use Aurelion as the carry or Olaf helps out a lot. In addition to that, you can use Swain as a carry in the late game since he's one of the strongest 5-cost champions. There's also the fact that Dragonsoul has a presence throughout the whole game. Early on, you can use either Tristana or Brand with Dragonsoul, while the early rounds of the mid-game are great for Shyvana. Once you hit level 7 and beyond, you'll have access to Aurelion and Olaf, and of course, late game, there's Swain. With so many viable champions throughout the game, it makes the trait, and also the composition, far more consistent than a lot of the other meta builds. But it's not all great for Dragonsoul because it will be weaker than players focusing more on Slayer or Mage, and they will be contesting units for them. That said, if you're in a position to run Dragonsoul, it's often worth the investment to earn yourself at least a top 4 placement. Up next, we have the number 4 composition, Keeper. Keeper is nestled right between the top 3 compositions and all of the other viable builds in the meta. Not quite strong enough to always go toe-to-toe with the best, but is capable of consistently top 4ing. What makes Keeper strong is how inherently defensive the build is when clumped up, but the strength is also one of the major flaws of the build. Against a lot of those builds, the insane amount of shields you'll get will drastically lower the damage taken, so you want to clump up to make the most of those shields. But against a lot of top-end builds, it will suffer because of units like Aurelion Sol, Samira, Olaf, and Kayle. Basically, those compositions have access to enough AoE that being clumped up is a huge downside. While this does sound like a huge weakness overall, at the end of the day, you have to keep in mind that each lobby is different. Keeper may be weaker against a high-roll lobby that's hitting those early Aurelion Sol 2 stars or finding Samira 2 during stage 5. In other lobbies where the pace of the game is a bit slower, having Keeper stall out the fights for Kennen and Xayah to clean up is going to be a lot better. All in all, you're not going to be in a great position to win games when running Keeper the majority of the time, but if you're looking for a consistent build to top 4 with, Keeper is the way to go. Let's move on to the composition coming in at number 3, Kayle Executioner. Once again, the meta has embraced Kayle as a top tier and consistent carry champion. Builds that utilize her as the primary carry are quite popular, which is why Kayle is one of the top 3 compositions in the current meta. The reason for this is that most builds don't have a way to kill Kayle before she ramps up in a fight, and Kayle is quite good against clump builds like Keeper or Cultist. The downside for Kayle mostly has to do with Slayers being in the meta. Most of the Slayer carries, and thus builds that use them, can easily outscale and win against Kayle builds. In order to come close to beating those compositions, the Kayle player has to position perfectly and honestly needs a lot of luck on their side for high rolling. Still, it's definitely possible for Kayle to win over Slayer compositions. And for what board is best to play with Kayle? Well, that varies a lot. The core definitely needs to utilize both Executioner and Divine, but how much you invest into those two traits depends on your items and what other champions you're finding. But the easiest way to think about it is to have at least one other Executioner, one other Divine, and a solid frontline to buy time for Kayle. Overall, you won't be disappointed by running Kayle in the current meta, as even low-roll Kayle games can still squeak out a top 4 if played well. Next up, we have Mages coming in as the number 2 composition. If there's one word to describe the top 2 composition for the current meta, it's flexibility. Mage is all about flexible play since there's so many different variations that you can run. Of course, it is worth noting that yes, Aurelion Sol is the key to running a Mage composition, but he's strong enough at just 1 star that you'll usually be able to find him every game. The flexibility of Mage comes from the fact that all you need is 3 Mage trait with Aurelion Sol. That's it. That's the only requirement. Past that, you can fill in the rest of your board with anything you're able to. That said, there's definitely specific variations that players run the most. The 2 most common are 7 Mage and Elderwood Mage. 7 Mages is exactly how it sounds. You need either a chosen mage or a mage spatula and to toss in a bunch of mage champions. The important units here are Aurelion as the primary carry and Annie for frontline. In addition to mages, you can toss in some vanguards for a better frontline, Swain for Dragonsoul, or most other 5-cost champions. Elderwood Mage, on the other hand, is a little less open since you're trying to find 6 Elderwood with 5 mages. To do this consistently, you'll either need a chosen Elderwood or a mage. Whichever way you go about playing the build, it does well because Elderwood units have the potential to stall out a fight thanks to their stat increases, which gives Aurelion Soul time to wipe the board. As we've stated several times, the key to running Mage is Aurelion Soul. So as long as you're able to secure him for your board, you'll be in a good position. And now we can move on to talk about the number 1 composition for patch 11.6, Slayer. This should be obvious for anyone familiar with the past few metas, as Slayer has been at the top for quite some time. As mentioned previously, the top 2 compositions are all about flexibility. While Mage is quite flexible, it does rely heavily on finding Aurelion Soul as the carry. But in a Slayer composition, you can have multiple options between Olaf, Tryndamere, and Samira. Heck, even Zed can be used as a carry in niche circumstances. The fact that Slayer has multiple carries helps out a lot because you don't have to worry about 2-starring a specific champion. It also makes pivoting from a 1-star carry to another much easier. If you're unable to 2-star your Olaf but hit a Tryndamere, pivot into him. Can't find either of those champions but found a Samira? There you go, you've got a solid carry. We really shouldn't undersell Samira as she's one of, if not the, best champion. Since all 3 of them can use the same items, it makes your job a lot easier when you're forced to pivot. The other reason why Slayer compositions do so well is that all you really need is the 3 Slayer trait. Beyond that, you can fill the rest of your board with frontline, splash traits like Siphoner, or Dragonsoul in the case of Olaf. Basically, the sky's the limit to what you put alongside a Slayer. Overall, it's great to see the meta favor flexible compositions, but there's definitely a distinct advantage for Slayers over every other build. Alright, that's going to be it for our top 5 compositions for patch 11.6. But as usual, we've got some honorable mentions to cover. With there being so many viable builds in the meta, we'll be covering quite a few of them. Our first honorable mention is Talon Morgana. The build has several names such as Siphoner Enlightened, Talon Enlightened, or Assassin Enlightened. At the heart of it, the core concept is utilizing Talon and Morgana as the 2 main carries. Either of them can work well as the main carry, with Talon being more consistent and easier to run. The basics of this composition is to debuff the enemy with Morgana, while Talon hops around, cleaning up squishy targets. If you're able to high roll it early enough, you can gain a huge advantage against other players since their boards won't be able to handle the snowball of Talon in a fight. But there are issues with this comp. The number 1 issue is that Talon, as a damage dealer, lacks consistency. Against players that position well, Talon is often unable to do anything in a fight. This is especially true against builds that are inherently defensive, like Fabled, or clumped up, like Keeper. On all, this comp is solid enough to earn itself a top 4 placement consistently, but don't expect to win any games with it unless you're high rolling like crazy. Let's move on to our next honorable mention, Fabled. Fabled, also known as Vanguard Mystic, is in an interesting position. If you high roll the necessary champions and hit Nico 3, you can easily win games. But if you have average luck or get contested, it's quite possible to bottom 4. The lack of consistency is ultimately what prevents Fabled from being in our top 5. Besides Nico and the other Fabled champions, you'll generally need Sejuani, Aatrox, and Ornn. Ornn isn't completely necessary, but if you want to win, he's pretty much essential. Because those 3 champions are heavily contested, it can be difficult to find them at all, let alone to 2-star them. But as we said, if you can get all of those pieces, you'll potentially be able to win the game. Next, we have 2 variations of Sivir Carry. Sivir, when 3-starred, is a potent mid to late game carry. The 2 most common variations when running her are Spirit Sharpshooter or Cultist. Cultist can be done in several ways, ranging from just 3 to fully committing to 9. At the end of the day, the most common scenario when using Cultist is having 6 of them during the mid-game to win streak with. Spirit Sharpshooter is a little harder to pull off because you need to hit Sivir 2 relatively early on in the game. This can be bypassed somewhat by Tristana, but with the nerfs he received in 11.6, Tristana is no longer that reliable of a carry beyond stage 3. If you're looking to run Sivir as your main carry with a composition built around her, just keep in mind that the only way to play her consistently is to 3-star her no later than stage 5. Whew, we did say that there were a lot of builds to cover. We have just a few more, with our next honorable mention being Brawler. Brawler has made a comeback in the meta during 11.5 and has remained a solid mid-game build since then. The main issue with 8 Brawler builds is that they can struggle to scale late game if you're not hitting key upgrades. The first being Shyvana 3, the second being Set 2. Without those 2 important upgrades, Brawlers will struggle to even top 4. That said, if you can hit a Shyvana 2 during Stage 3 or early Stage 4, you should usually be in a strong enough position to meet the win condition requirements. There's one last build to talk about, but let's first quickly mention that you can play a few reroll builds like Duelist, Tristana, Cultist, and Nasus. They aren't perfect, but they get the job done if you high roll early game. Anyway, the last honorable mention for patch 11.6 is Warlords. Warlords got a decent boost in 11.6 with Katarina, Vi, and Garen all receiving buffs. Despite those buffs, there's not many players running Warlord into the late game as, for the most part, the build spikes hardest during the mid game and usually gets outscaled in the late game. Of course, if you're able to hit a Katarina 3 or 9 Warlord, you have a strong chance at placing in the top 2 or 3. At the end of the day, the best way to utilize Warlords is to spike with them during Stage 3 and 4 and then pivot into a different composition. And that is it for today's video, folks. It's great to see that the meta has so many viable compositions, even though it's still being dominated by Slayers. Let us know in the comments section below what compositions you've been climbing with, and if there's any we missed in our top 5. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.